You know, there's absolutely no doubt today that one of the most confusing things in wine is this whole issue of Pinot Gris and Pinot Grigio. It confuses people so much, it confuses winemakers, and even the Australian Wine Research Institute recently put out a technical guide so winemakers can tell from their wine and what it tastes like whether or not it should be called a Pinot Gris or a Pinot Grigio. I think that's completely ridiculous personally, because if you're a winemaker you should know what you're doing before you start. But having said that, there is a huge amount of confusion between Gris and Grigio. The point is they are exactly the one grape variety. Now let's just call it Pinot Gris for a moment. And Pinot Gris comes from the Alsace area in France, okay? A very, very cool region in the northeast of France where it produces a luscious, round, beautifully flavoured, generous table wine that can be very dry, it can be quite sweet, and most of the Pinot Gris from Alsace has got a little bit of sweetness to it. It can also make what they call vendange tardive, late harvest, luscious sweet dessert wines as well, but principally we're talking about what we'd call off-dry, very fragrant, floral, perfumed white wines with characteristic flavours principally of pear, apple, maybe a little bit of lime juice. So that is the Pinot Gris. Now let's hop across the border into Italy, and all across the north of Italy down to central Italy, Pinot Grigio is a very, very commonly made wine. Now, Pinot Grigio is once again the same thing as Pinot Gris, but it's made typically into a less alcoholic, finer, more savoury wine that has a completely different flavour profile and perfume to Pinot Gris. And a Grigio will typically smell a little bit creamy, a little bit nutty, maybe a little bit citrusy, and have quite a long, fine, dry, savoury, citrusy palate structure. So completely different from the juicy, slightly sweet, more perfumed and floral Pinot Gris from France. Okay, they're the two international benchmarks. Now, Pinot Gris and Pinot Grigio have travelled all over the place. You get in Oregon, in the United States, some fantastic Pinot Gris. New Zealand, Central Otago in particular, some amazing Pinot Gris. There's a little bit of good Pinot Gris grown in Australia as well, and we'll be tasting one of those shortly. Pinot Grigio also made all over the world in this style, US, New Zealand, Australia, South America. It's a very, very popular wine. But once again, into that more savoury, more elegant, dusty, dry expression of the variety. So the best way to resolve this confusion is actually to open a bottle of each, a Pinot Gris and a Pinot Grigio, both of which incidentally come from Australia, taste the wines and solve this confusion once and for all. Okay, then to start this comparison, I have firstly from Tim Adams in the Clare Valley, Pinot Gris 2013 vintage. And it's going to be compared to a wine made by an Italian family in the King Valley in northeastern Victoria, the Pizzini, a Pinot Grigio 2013. So both the same vintage, same variety, but produced in entirely different expressions. So, whoops, to start off then, Tim Adams. Tim Adams here. When I'm looking at it, I'm sort of tilting over and I'm seeing quite a deal of colour evolution. It's heading almost into straw yellow, still with traces of green. It's quite evolved for a young wine. But there are reasons for that, because this has been really made into a richer style. It's had a little bit of lees contact and perhaps even a little bit of oak. Smelling it, it's very floral. It's very youthful, very floral. And we're getting a little bit of creaminess, a little bit of pear, a little bit of apple, the typical sort of Gris aromas that you expect. Just a little bit of spice as well, which is not atypical for this variety. Tasting that wine, it's delicious. And I've got to say, I'm not a huge fan of Pinot Gris in Australia by and large. I've actually been on the record as saying that Melbourne tap water is perhaps more interesting than most Pinot Gris grown in Australia, except this one is quite delicious. It's got a creamy, round, lovely, long, delicious length of flavour. The acids are quite soft but quite evident. It's very, very smooth, almost voluptuous and quite approachable. It's not a wine I'd be wanting to keep for more than 2 or 5 years. I think that's pretty typical also for a Pinot Gris, but quite exemplary in terms of what it's delivering. So it's really delivering on the promise and the suggestion made by the name Pinot Gris on the label. So let's go now to the Pizzini Pinot Grigio. This one is relatively pale. It's got a straw colour, just a hint of yellow perhaps, and still some green. So it's sort of that intermediary colour. Ah, lovely. Very waxy, very floral, very citrusy. I'm sort of thinking citrus blossom, a little bit of spice again. Very, very typical. A little bit earthy too, because these guys, the Pizzinis, like introducing a little bit of funkiness and a little bit of wildness into their wine. It's really, really quite charming and quite enticing. Once again, they've drilled this. Long, fine, tight. It's citrusy, but it's got this earthy, slightly meaty character that becomes really quite savoury towards the finish. It's really exemplary Pinot Grigio. It's got fantastic length, and the acids are very evident but very tightly integrated into the fruit, so you're not left with an impression of a really high acid style. But these wines are really quite definitive and very, very emphatically what their labels are proclaiming. Now, this is a rare thing around the New World, particularly in Australia. So I've just got to take my hat off to each of these two makers for really delivering on the varietal promise. Most importantly, however, to take away from this tasting is that the Grigio style, as exemplified here by the Pizzini, is that finer, drier, tighter, more savoury, more citrusy wine. The Gris is that more perfumed, floral, vibrant, luscious, almost more juicy style, which the Tim Adams company has really done really well with from their 2013 vintage. So those are the key things to take from this. In terms of cellaring potential, no. Really 2 to 5 years max for these wines. It would take a particularly brilliant Pinot Gris, typically from Alsace, that you'd want to cellar for more than, say, 2 to 5 years. So from most of the wines, so-called New World, Australia, New Zealand, Oregon, where these varieties are really common, I would say drink them relatively young and keep the best of them for 2 to 5 years. So with that in mind, hopefully we've resolved the confusion between Pinot Gris and Pinot Grigio. So get out there and do the experiment and do the comparison for yourselves, and don't be surprised if the labels don't quite sort of stack up to what's actually inside the bottle.